Um, Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us today. I greet you with our very unique Arabic greeting. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. My name is Souad Ali. I am the founding chair of the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies, head of Classics and Middle Eastern Studies, director of the Arabic Studies program, a professor of Middle Eastern Studies, Arabic and Islamic Studies in the School of International Latin Cultures, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. I'm very pleased to have you all here. It is my distinct pleasure and delight to warmly welcome our distinguished guest speaker, President Zeinab Badawi, to ASU. Before introducing her and her talk today, allow me please to introduce to you, and especially those joining us for the first time, the ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies, including definitely African Studies, that host this lecture today. The ASU Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies was established at Arizona State University to acknowledge the significant contributions of Arabic studies and Islamic civilization and cultures to the world at large, both historically and in the modern age. The Council's research and teaching programs seek to promote multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures through Arabic, as well as other Middle Eastern languages, including Persian and Turkish. And of course, we have other Middle Eastern languages at our school, including Hebrew, and we are hoping to include more African languages such as Kiswahili. The Council seeks to develop constructive academic and cultural interaction and partnerships between ASU, Arizona State University, and similar groups in the Arab, African, and Muslim worlds at large. My own conviction has been in an interdependent world, literature is often conceived as a cultural tool to facilitate greater human understanding. The more we study others' literary arts, cultures, and civilizations, the better enabled we become to achieve understanding and hopefully work toward world peace, especially in this very difficult time in the world with all of the turmoil, especially in the Middle East and other parts of the world as well. At this point, allow me please to introduce our distinguished speaker and her speech today. President of the London University School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, Dr. Zeinab Badawi holds degrees from Oxford University and a postgraduate with distinction from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. She has worked in the British media for 4 decades on programs such as the BBC's Hard Talk. Dr. Badawi has won many awards and several honorary doctorates and has produced a major 20-part TV series on the history of Africa and is currently writing a book on this that is forthcoming. In being president of London University, she is a member of the board of the think tank Barometer and Minds, the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, a member of the Africa-Europe Foundation, a board member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the Arts, Humanities and Research Council of UKRI, of the Royal Foundation and the Royal Opera House. A Sudanese British citizen, President Zeinab Badawi was born in the Sudan and moved to London at the age of 2. Before I introduce her talk today, I would like to ask everybody, please mute your sounds. Thank you very much for observing that so that we have a very clear, introduction and President Zeinab's talk. And then we will, allow you to open them after her talk to if you have any questions and during the question and answer sessions. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Her talk today is titled, Why the History of Africa Matters, arguing that Africa's history holds immense importance of people of African descent and the global community as well in diaspora. It is the cradle of human civilization, featuring remarkable narratives of powerful rulers, advanced civilizations, and vibrant trade routes. Unfortunately, the history of Africa has been overshadowed by narratives of slavery and colonialism written by Western perspectives. President Badawi, seeking a comprehensive history told by Africans themselves, embarked on a 10-year journey across African countries, gathering first-hand experience, information, and insights from diverse individuals. The lack of knowledge about African history, she argues, is evident, but she draws inspiration from the General History of Africa project, a UNESCO-supported initiative led by African scholars to decolonize the continent's history. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming President Zeinab Badawi. Dr. Badawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Souad, for your very generous introduction. And hello to everybody who is on this Zoom and beyond. Why does the history of Africa matter? Well, it should matter to you because all of you, regardless of where you come from, what you look like, you can have blonde hair, blue eyes, whatever, you are an African export, because Africa's history is your history. It is where humankind originated. And so don't you want to know about the continent of your birth, your mother continent? Which is why I say that the TV series and the book that I've just finished is a book for everyone, because everybody is either originally African or is somebody who is living in Africa or, like me, in the diaspora of African descent. Africa's history also matters because it is shrouded in ignorance. If I were to ask you to name an African king or queen, I don't know what you'd say, but when I commonly ask people this question, they usually scratch their head and they'll say Tutankhamun, and then it's followed by, oh, but was he really African? A queen, they'll say Cleopatra. And even if they give you these dates, these names, they don't even know where they fit. They don't know too much about them. So I personally think ignorance is not a good state of affairs. And so we shouldn't be ignorant about Africa's history. And by that, I mean Africa's history right from the start. We tend to focus on Africa's history from the colonial era onwards, but we know very little about its pre-colonial history. And in my book, I have 18 chapters. I don't get to the transatlantic slave trade until chapter 14. So it shows you that there's a great deal of history before that. Africa's history also matters because it's not been told very well. It's either been denigrated, or Africans have been told they have no history, or it's been written by outsiders. Some of these outsiders, the Africanists, the Western scholars, some of them are brilliant, very, very, good minds, and they're ideologically sound and so on. But Africans, I think uniquely, African academics and scholars, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, paleontologists, have been rather excluded from the telling of their own story, which is so important to me. This is another very important aspect of the project I've embarked on for the best part of a decade, is to accord Africans the respect and the dignity of telling their own story. And I think they need to occupy the public space intellectually, and they ought to be transmitters of their own story on the global stage. So I see myself just as a conduit, as it were, a facilitator, an intercessor between these academics on the continent and the world at large. So, you know, we're familiar with histories of Africa by the great, brilliant Ali Mazrui, for instance, in the 70s. We've had series about African civilization by a British Ghanaian, Gus Casely Hayford. But they will tell you what they think about their history, which is fine. They've got, you know, very valid views. But what I think is important, and what mattered to me, was if I went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I would speak to Congolese historians and people, because ordinary people are also custodians of their own histories and tradition. If I went to Algeria, I'd speak to Algerians. So it's the people of the actual place that I'm talking about who I allow them to tell us their story. So who tells the story is very, very important. That matters to me. Ignorance about Africa is not good because it leads to a lack of understanding about Africans. And as Dr. Souad said, we live in an interconnected world. I'm a member of the African diaspora in the UK. I've lived in the UK since I was 2 years of age. There are many African Americans. There are many people of African descent in Brazil, in the Caribbean, all over the world, living in Europe. And how these people are seen is very important, because history is not only about the past, it informs our present and helps shape our future. So in telling a more comprehensive story of Africa, a history of Africa from time immemorial to the present era, it leads, I believe, to greater understanding. Greater understanding leads to greater empathy. Greater empathy leads to, you know, can help promote a culture of peace, of cooperation, of consensus, and justice, actually. Empathy often leads to justice. And I think that's important. It matters in this current debate that we are certainly having in the UK, at universities here, but also obviously mirrored all over the world, issues such as reparations for the sins of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and also the Indian Ocean slave trade, which involved Arab traders and their Swahili counterparts. We also have a debate about restitution. You know, all the museums and private collections in the world that hold African art. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was a study commissioned by the French government by 2 academics, one French and one Senegalese, and they found that 90%, at least 90% of African art and artifacts were held outside the continent. So it's obviously a big issue about, you know, should we repatriate some of these objects? And indeed, you know, particularly pertaining to the Benin bronzes, we've seen that happen. So the restitution about statues, you know, here, whether the statue of Cecil Rhodes, the 19th century entrepreneur, mining magnate, should be brought down from outside the Oxford College where he's standing, at Oriel College, overlooking the high street. But, you know, he's just one of many. We've seen the same debate in the United States about statues, Confederate statues, and so on. So all these debates today, and racism, of course, you know, triggered by the George Floyd and the movement, you know, BMM, that you know, these talking about the restitution debate. I think you heard that bit about the Benin bronzes and so on.
Yes,
exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then I said, obviously, the statue, the debate about, you know, triggered by George Floyd's killing and so on, racism. It led to a lot of soul searching about relations between people of African descent and wherever they may be living. So it triggered a whole load of debate, but you can't really consider these contemporary topics, in my opinion, unless you can anchor them in a historical context. So, you know, we had King Charles rather, go to Kenya October the 31st, he made a speech expressing regret for British actions during the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, when up to 100,000 people, according to the Kenya Human Rights Commission, were either killed, about 10,000 were killed, or tortured, abused, or detained. And so, you know, the king felt that it was right for him to go in 2023 to say that this was a stain on British history. So you see what I mean about why history matters, because it's not only about the past, it's also about the present. Why did I get interested in this topic? Well, I mean, I have been a student of history myself, so I've always been interested in it. But I think what really made me consider all these things that I've been talking to you about and why it matters was I had a conversation with my mother. Mashallah, she's 95 years of age next month. And this was about maybe 15 years ago. Both my parents, actually, my late father, and, you know, these are educated people. And I asked them what they knew about the history of Sudan, their ancient history, because Sudan has got a marvelous ancient history. We have 1,000 pyramids. There are 100 in Egypt, 1,000 in Sudan. About 300 preserve their superstructure. We've got in Sudan, you know, wonderful temples and statues of Kushite kings and so on. So I asked my parents what they knew, and my mother just said, oh, I think we were taken to see the pyramids once, but if you asked her to give us a date or to give me any information about Sudan's ancient history, she drew a blank. So this started me on a journey. I talked to one former Nigerian president, and I asked him about African history, and he said, you know what, I could actually recite the names of British medieval kings, English medieval kings, better than I could tell you about African history. I was in Lagos. I went around Lagos University. I talked to the students there, the brightest and the best in Nigeria. And I said, what do you know about your history? And they said, well, the slave coast was in what is Nigeria today. So there was the slave trade. Nigeria was formed as a country in 1914. And I said, what else do you know about your past? And that was it. So it made me realize that actually there was this, you know, dearth of knowledge. And I have to confess that I myself consider myself an educated person. I can give you, you know, a bit of Asian history, Middle East, of course, you know, European and so on. But even I, on African history, didn't know very much. So I was in the offices of the Deputy Director General of UNESCO in about 2013, Getachew Ngida, wonderful Ethiopian man. And I was chatting to him. I was there doing something else. And then I saw this bookcase behind him. And I said, with some books in it called the GHA, the General History of Africa. And I said, Getachew, what are those volumes? And he said, oh, don't you know? I said, no. He said, these are the General History of Africa volumes. And I said, what are they? He said, well, at that time, there were 9 volumes. There are now 10, possibly 11. He said, this is the history of Africa, compiled and written by, for the most part, Africans, about 80% Africans. There were other experts from outside the continent. And I said, tell me more. So he said in the 1960s, during that period of rapid decolonization in Africa, the newly independent African presidents, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, they said, look, you know, we've decolonized our countries. We want to decolonize our history. So there was a very enlightened director general at the time, a Frenchman called René Maillot. This is early 60s at UNESCO. And he said, all right, I will facilitate this process. And I believe the Africans had to pay for it. But UNESCO put all its resources and they scoured the continent of Africa for the best experts, you know, archaeologists, musicologists, you know, historians, and they compiled volume after volume after volume of Africa's history. written by Africans themselves. They are wonderful volumes, but they are not easily read by the general reader. So, I mean, I got them and I plowed my way through them, and I used them as my kind of North Star, as my compass, my inspiration to get Africans to relate their own story. And I said to Getachew Ngida, you know, this is UNESCO's best kept secret. You must let me make a TV series drawing on the knowledge in these volumes. And he said, yes, you know, by all means. So I went through a process and I managed to get the agreement from UNESCO to allow me to say that the book, the series, the TV series drew on the general history of Africa. The experts I spoke to, I ran the list, you know, whichever country I was in, I would run it past the Africa team at UNESCO. So I started making this TV series. And I made sure I only used African TV crews, because I think the telling of the story is not just the words, but it's also who's behind the camera. And a lot of people here in London said, oh no, take a British TV crew with you, you know, they'll be much better and so on. And I said, no, it's got to be, you know, a Zambian film crew in Zambia, a Zimbabwean film crew in Zimbabwe. And actually it was the best decision I made, because these crews, if they talked to some local women or whatever, you know, they wouldn't be reticent. They could speak to them in their own language. And so people just really opened up for me, because I didn't only just speak to experts, I also spoke to ordinary people about their history, you know, ordinary citizens. But what the general history of Africa, not only did it use African sources, which is what I did, it also said, look, there is this sense that Africa does not have any history because Africa didn't always write. Parts of the continent did, some parts of the continent didn't. But just because they didn't write, it didn't mean they didn't record their history. It just means you have to get at it in a different way. And that's what the African experts in the general history of Africa did. They, you know, would look at oral tradition, see how it was supported by archaeological evidence. They'd, you know, study dance, music, or whatever. So a whole, you know, range of sources, as well as non-Western sources, you know, Persian, Arabic, or whatever, because Chinese, because the Africans have always been part of the world. They've not been this sort of isolated, dark continent as people see it. You know, they've traded with the Far East for, you know, millennia. So that was all reflected in the TV series, and it's on BBC YouTube. It's a free resource. You can all watch it, 20 45-minute programs. So I went to 34 African countries, 34 or 54, over a period of about 7 years. But I came back and I was troubled, and I thought, you know what? Yes, the TV series is good. It shows the beauty of the continent, and it is a beautiful continent. But I don't feel I've done justice to all those brilliant scholarly minds that I interviewed. I could only select bits of what they said to me, because obviously there's not a lot you can do in a TV program. So I had all these interviews, these transcripts, and, you know, I had spent time with, it was a privilege for me to spend time with these people, with these academics. And I felt, therefore, that I had to do more and to put it in a book. Hence the book, which comes out in April next year, is called An African History of Africa, An African History of Africa, and it's published in the US by HarperCollins. So, you know, the reason why I said I felt that I had to put these African intellectuals, try and put them in the spotlight, was, you know what the traffic is like in some African cities, Nairobi, Kinshasa, and so on. And sometimes I'd arrive really late, not my fault, because I was trying to pack so much in. But these academics, they'd all wait for me, and they'd be like, no, don't worry. And I'd have to tear myself away from them, because they were just so keen to tell me about their history. And the film crews who were filming them, I could just see that they were all silent. You know, the sound recorders, the camera crew, they would all listen. And we worked really, really hard. We'd start at the crack of dawn and we'd finish at 10 o'clock sometimes. And at the end of each trip, every single trip, the crew would say to me, Zeinab, you worked us really, really hard. And they'd hold me by the hand and say, but thank you, because I have learned about my country's history. And it really, you know, it warmed me and touched me very, very much. So that's why this book and this whole project is a passion for me, because you know, I saw the kind of reaction that it elicited. And, you know, I cast my mind back to when I was an undergraduate at Oxford University in the late 70s, early 80s. You know, there was a British professor of history who had just retired, Professor Hugh Trevor Roper. And Professor Hugh Trevor Roper, you know, highly regarded British historian. Some of you probably know this quote, but in the 60s, before I went to Oxford, obviously, I'm going to read you this quote of what he said, because it pertains to African history. And this is what Professor Hugh Trevor Roper said. He said, "It is fashionable to speak today as if European history were devalued, as if historians in the past have paid too much attention to it, and as if nowadays we should pay less. Undergraduates, seduced as always by the changing breadth of journalistic fashion, demand that they should be taught the history of Black Africa. Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none, or very little. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America, and darkness is not a subject for history." He says, "I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had a life and culture interesting to sociologists and anthropologists. But history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement, and purposive movement too." He says, "If all history is equal, as some now believe, there is no reason why we should study one section of it rather than another, for certainly we cannot study it all." So he, you know, that's the way, I mean, I could go on and on, but he finishes this by saying, "We may neglect our own history and amuse ourselves with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe." So, you know, that is a view that has proven, I mean, nobody would say it so bluntly now, but it has proved remarkably durable in some areas. I mean, there are many good British historians who do very good work on Africa, but I was very struck a couple of years ago during the debate about whether the British Museum and other museums and colleges here that hold Benin bronzes should return them to Benin. And there was an article by Michael Mosbacher in The Spectator, which said, should we really give these bronzes back to a people who practiced human sacrifice and cannibalism? And I thought to myself, what's that got to do with the current debate today? But you see how quickly some people, some quarters will try to imply that, oh, you know, these people are backward, we shouldn't return our Benin bronzes, let's keep them in our lovely museums and so on. And so I'm not saying it's an all-encompassing view, but it's interesting that it has actually lasted. And, you know, why cite the actions of people in the Benin Kingdom, you know, human sacrifice? I mean, I'm not denying that these things took place, but they've had far too much focus. And to suggest that the sins of the parents should be visited on the people of Benin today is very inconsistent, because the same people say, we shouldn't, you know, express regret for colonialism because that was done by our forefathers. It's got nothing to do with us. And yet the argument doesn't work the other way, does it? So that's another reason why I think that I really felt that this was a passion project, and why I should really try to impress upon people that Africa has got this, you know, wonderful history. So what I've done in the book is that I start from the origins of humankind. I try and overturn some common misperceptions, things like I look at Africa's traditional religions, how humans have evolved over the, you know, the millennia. You know, people talk about animism. That's not the case. It's not true. It's a misnomer. Ancestor worship, again, you know, they venerate and respect the ancestors, but not ancestor worship. You know, there are so many things which are just mentioned, and they actually are not warranted in reality. And I think I mean, I thought long and hard about whether I should start with the origins of humankind, you know, Lucy, or Dinkanesh, to give her Ethiopian name, and all the others. But the general history of Africa starts with the origins of humankind, because that debate is settled. Everybody, all the scientists agree that human beings originated, you know, us, modern Homo sapiens sapiens, originated in Africa. There's still a bit of debate about which part of Africa, you know, the North will say my bones are older than your bones in the East, or whatever. That doesn't matter, but it is definitely from the continent. And we migrated about 60,000 years ago to other parts of the world, went to the Arabian Peninsula, what would broadly be speaking today be Yemen, first. And, you know, the other thing that my research uncovered, my conversations with paleontologists, is that until between 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, there was no white race. As recently as that, between 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, nobody can be certain until they actually find a skin. But, you know, as I said at the outset, green eyes, red hair, blonde hair, blue eyes, whatever, a very, very recent phenomenon. And it's that, when you think about that, it's not a very helpful construct, is it, for people who profess racism? So that's why I wanted to start there, to try to emphasize, you know, our common humanity. And then, of course, I look at the great civilizations. Ancient Egypt, probably the part of Africa that's best known. But what I have tried to do in the book also is to tap into current debates about the issues raised, because my approach to history is I may focus on an individual or a community, but I use it as a way of drawing lessons of the past and seeing how they are relevant today. So with the ancient Egypt chapter, what I was very keen to do is to keep Africa whole. I don't like this division between, you know, the Arab North and what's called sub-Saharan Africa. It's all Africa. And if you go to the so-called Arab North, you'll find that there are people who are quite clearly, you know, African and so on. It's just an idea that people have of what an African should look like. But I was aware of the debate, you know, when Adele James, the Black British actress, was cast as Cleopatra. It led to a bit of an outcry in Egypt. How can you have, you know, a Black British actress? I'm not saying the Egyptians were racist at all. They're not at all. But they said quite rightly that Cleopatra was of Macedonian descent and wouldn't have been Black. But it did kind of tap into a debate about, you know, who is African? What do you mean by African? I was born in the Sudan, and I therefore, you know, have both African and Arab descent. My mother tongue is Arabic. My blood is a mixture of Arab and African. I claim both. It doesn't matter. So I was very, very keen with ancient Egypt to make sure that it is very much anchored in the history of Africa. You'd forgive me for saying that the next chapter, I'm not going to go through all the chapters, by the way, but because it's too much, but forgive me for saying that my favorite chapter, of course, is about Kush, the kingdom of Kush, which is northern Sudan, which is where my family hail. And I think that unlike its brilliant neighbor to the north, Egypt. Very little is known about ancient Sudan, and yet it's got a remarkable, remarkable history, particularly in the 8th century BCE, before the Common Era, which is the area I focused on, the kings of Kush, who defeated and governed Egypt for the best part of a century. They became a regional power. They fought the Assyrians. They were the protectors of King Hezekiah of Judea. One of the kings is mentioned in the Bible, and, so on and so forth. Ethiopia, King Ezana in the 4th century, embraces, in the 4th century CE, Common Era, embraces Christianity. And Ethiopia, after Armenia, is the second kingdom in the world to have Christianity as its official religion, which of course was the case in Ethiopia until 1975, very, very recent. So what I try to do in the history is, even if it's a bit of history that some people might be familiar with, Carthage, for instance, the destruction of Carthage, which is in modern day Tunisia, just, in Tunis, the capital. People have heard about the destruction of Carthage, but they've seen it through a Roman prism, through a Roman lens. What I do is I invert the telescope and I look at the North Africans who were living there. So King Massinissa of the Numidians is, my focus when I look at that. He lived in the 200s BCE, an amazing, amazing character. He lived to about 90, and he was obviously very virile, because when he died at 90, he had a 4-year-old son. So it's quite extraordinary. So in North Africa, obviously the Meronids in the 1200s, the Almohads in the 1100s. These are great Islamic dynasties whose influence extended as far as Europe. I look at queens as well, Kahina in the late 600s, who fought, the Berber queen who fought the Arabs when they came into North Africa, went into Egypt in the 640s and then went further into North Africa. Again, a very, very charismatic woman. The empire, there's just so much history. What can I say? There's, the Ghana Empire, which confusingly has nothing to do with modern day Ghana, which started in the 600s. You've probably heard of Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire. He lived in the he was born around 1280. Mansa Musa is probably the richest individual to have ever lived in history, period. The richest individual. Wonderful Professor Doulay Konate in Mali, amazing man, really brilliant mind, said that estimates of his wealth in today's value would be about $430 billion US dollars. And, it shows you that Africa, because, we all know, I think some of you know the story of how when he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca, he spent so much money en route in Cairo that the price of gold was depressed for 7 years. But that just shows you, see, through this individual micro history, you understand a greater story, which is Africa has not been isolated from the rest of the world. It was part of the global economy. Of course, Africa's history is also one of tragedy. And after the celebration of African history, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, which European visitors could not believe had been built by an African people, and said all sorts of people had built it, the Phoenicians, the Queen of Sheba, and they gave her some kind of, Asian genesis and so on. So I just digress here on Great Zimbabwe because, when you had Rhodesia, which of course was white minority rule in Rhodesia in the 1960s, when they declared a unilateral declaration of independence from Britain, the study of Great Zimbabwe, built by Africans, Black Africans, probably the Shona people, was not allowed. And if archaeologists said this was built by Black Africans, they'd lose their job, they'd be sacked. One of them actually had to leave the country. So it just shows you how pernicious and how, you know, pervasive the efforts to erase African history were. It's just like, you know, the old days of the Soviet Politburo. You fall out of favor, they erase your image from the photograph. And that's what's happened. And I was with a wonderful professor in Zimbabwe, Professor Bebe, who is one of Africa's most distinguished historians. He was born in 1942, so you can work out his age. And he said, when he, growing up near Great Zimbabwe, not taught a thing about it. You know, he was only taught about the history of Europeans in Zimbabwe. And he said, you know, he came to it very late in life. It was a privilege for me to walk around the ruins, the wonderful stone ruins of Great Zimbabwe, which is the biggest stone structure in Africa, I think, after the pyramids. So you can see when I say, why does the history of Africa matter? It's actually, why does the right history of Africa matter? Because people know history matters. I mean, propagandists, you know, through time immemorial will try to write the kind of history that they want. But, you know, I feel that I have genuinely told the truth about Africa's history. And I don't shy away from difficult issues, because there are some difficult issues. The Indian Ocean slave trade, whereby the Arabs and Swahili, Swahili traders, African elites, were involved in the selling or facilitated the slave trade, both in the Indian Ocean slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, there are key differences between the transatlantic slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade. I mean, numerically, the Arab slave trade, in inverted commas, if you want to call it that, started much earlier, in the 700s, 800s, and continued until the 19th century, end of the 19th century, with people like Tipu Tip. I'm sure some of you have heard of him, the Zanzibari slave trader, who was operating right until the end of the 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade started in 1510 with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and of course was abolished in the early 1800s. Well, the slave trade was abolished around, you know, 1803 in England and similar time in other places, but slavery itself wasn't abolished until the 1830s. So, you know, but even when I look at the transatlantic slave trade, for example, I look at the enslaved Africans, and I also look at the impact on the continent itself. You know, what did it mean for the people of Africa? And I look at the memoirs of Olaudah Equiano, who was became an educated, enslaved, freed person who originated from Igbo land, what would today be Nigeria. So there are some slave memoirs. And so rather than looking at, you know, what happened to them once they got to North America or the Caribbean, which is what Hollywood does, I don't look at the white slave owners. I look at the enslaved Africans and see it from their perspective, and also the detrimental impact it had in so many ways, socially, politically, culturally, which still reverberates to this day. I think, interesting enough, there's more talk about the transatlantic slave trade than there is the Indian Ocean slave trade. And I do think there needs to be a bigger debate between the Arab world and Africa. And I think that when we hear comments like the ones made by CAIS, the Tunisian president, and the kind of animosity that has existed against African migrants going across the Sahara in North Africa, I think there's clearly a lot to be done there in terms of, you know, trying to tackle the prejudice that exists in the Arab world against Black Africans. So I'm very keen to, that's why I said at the outset, why does history matter? It matters because it's relevant today, and you can tackle these kind of issues better today if you do have an understanding of what's gone on in the past. And I think empathy does breed justice. Empathy breeds understanding. Understanding breeds justice, I think, and justice is important. I support reparations myself. How you do them, it can be debated, but you know, I can expand on that. So I mean, yes, it's undeniable that once you get to the chapters in the book, the later chapters where the Europeans have arrived on the continent, it does become, you know, the chapters are littered with some tragedies, you know, what happened to the Congolese and so on. But I don't always like to depict, I don't depict the Africans just as victims, though. Even the transatlantic slave trade, you know, people will talk about William Wilberforce and the abolitionists, but actually Olaudah Equiano set up something called the Sons of Africa. And he and other freed slaves living in London at the time were really instrumental in abolition. I mentioned Haiti, you know, the world's first Black republic in 1804, and how its success reverberated across the world. I look at the fact that, you know, Africans didn't accept their servitude. They fought against it. You know, there were mutinies on ships. There were, you know, the case of Haiti, the uprising against the French colonial masters. So, you know, I try and show that the Africans were never robbed of agency. They're not just sort of sitting there like sitting ducks. But you can't get over the fact that there were, you know, that there are injustices. And of course, I can't not mention those in the book. So, for example, transatlantic slave trade, when it was finished in the Caribbean, I went to Barbados to do a bit of research there because they've got the best documents of all the Caribbean countries. You know, learned things like the average age of a field slave, they would work for 8 or 9 years, and that would be it. And if a woman, you know, became pregnant, she'd be worked right through her pregnancy. It didn't matter to them that, you know, they wouldn't say, oh, go and have your child or whatever. It didn't matter to them because there were just more slaves coming in all the time. But, you know, I discovered that, of course, when slavery was ended, the owners were given reparations, and Britain at the time had to take out a loan of £20 million to compensate the slave owners. And when the freed people were asked what their compensation was and where their money was, they were told, oh, your freedom is your compensation. And, you know, it was only until 2015, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, that the last installment of that debt was paid off by the British government. So, again, it's another example of how history is relevant in the present, you know. But this isn't a history which is contested. It's not, you know, a history which fuels division. I don't want to do that. It's to promote understanding, to shine a light. It's not, you know, it doesn't buy into the culture wars. I don't believe in that. It's merely there to really just, you know, say to people, African history is part of our global story. African history did not start with the transatlantic slave trade nor colonialism. You know, until 1880, most of Africa was in African hands. And of course, the Europeans were, you know, creating pressure and so on, but it was still nominally in Africa. Most of Africa was in African hands. And African countries were not really created until the 1890s. Obviously, there's some exceptions like Egypt and Ethiopia and so on. But because people often say to me, oh, how can you write a history of 54 countries? And I say, well, look, the countries were only formed, you know, after the scramble for Africa in the 1890s. So I try to put to rest some myths or like slavery was abolished because of a moral imperative. There was a moral imperative, but there was also an economic one, because once the Industrial Revolution started in Europe and in North America, there was no need for people to import lots of African labor. They needed them there in Africa so they could exploit the resources. You know, they wanted the rubber for their, you know, all sorts of uses in the Industrial Revolution. They needed all the materials and the riches that Africa has. So they needed the people there. So the economic imperative is very, very important. And that was really brought home to me by two wonderful professors in Liberia, Professor Ezra and Professor Carl Patrick Burrows, you know, wonderful professors. And they said, you know, you can't just look at the humanitarian moral imperative. So, and I try where I can to feminize the history, because I think that's also important. That matters, because we often tend to, you know, particularly with Africa, where you've had predominantly African leaders, be they kings, be they presidents today, you know, we don't have many African women leaders. And so I try where I can to look at some of the, you know, the women. There is an inevitable focus on rulers, because obviously a lot of sources rely on praise songs and oral tradition. So they are going to extol the virtues of their rulers. So ordinary people, it's a bit harder to get a very clear history of them. So Queen Njinga, for instance, of the Matamba people, who which was a vassal state of the Kingdom of Congo. Kimpavita, who lived just a little bit after her in the early 1700s. You know, Ya Asantewa of the Asante, who was really built up by Kwame Nkrumah. I look at the post-colonial era very briefly, thematically. I look at the themes, the reasons why Africa became independent. I deliver it to independence, but I don't look very at all really at the post-colonial period, because I feel that that has been looked at. You know, people know about apartheid and Nelson Mandela. They know about, you know, the more modern stuff. They've heard of Julius Nyerere. They've heard of, you know, Jomo Kenyatta and so on. And that for me was less interesting. I was more interested in the stuff which is occluded, which, you know, takes you further back. I'd like to leave half an hour for questions, but I think that you know, what I think it was one historian, I think it was Natalie Davis, who died quite recently, you know, who says something like, I feel that with this history, I tried to not only be a truth teller of the past, but also to give a history of hope. I don't want it to be a history which consigns Africa to, you know, forever being a victim. Of course, I have an epilogue at the end that looks at Africa today, and of course there are myriad challenges that Africa faces, but I would say that all the people I spoke to in Africa, all the historians, they're not starry-eyed about the continent as it is today, but they all have faith in the people, particularly the young people, because it is a young continent. And we all know the figures that, you know, by 2040, a quarter of the world will be African. By 2100, that figure will be 40%. And so you better start learning about Africa, because if they're going to be the producers, the consumers, and the workers by far in the greatest number. So that's why Africa's history matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, President Zeinab Badawi, for this very insightful talk about the history of Africa. I'm sure that everybody has enjoyed it as much as I have. And I don't want to take much time before opening it up for the audience. I know how valuable your time is. I would just, maybe make a comment about, you mentioned Professor Ali Mazrui and, the Africans, a triple heritage, and a very important book, definitely. And we look forward to your book forthcoming soon, inshallah. So I know that you said you did not look much into current Africa or Africa today, but people cannot help asking the question and posing several questions about what happened to Africa with all of this rich history, very rich history. What is happening to Africa today? And, this is, of course, definitely a completely different subject. This is a comment that you don't have to address, but
No,
maybe if you'd like, you said in your epilogue, you're talking about Africa today.
yeah. No, I'm happy to. I mean, Africa by rights, it is a very, very rich continent, and it has a very good birthright in that regard. And I would hope that, with the new mineral revolution coming up, that, it's got all the minerals that you need for the technological age, that it could become a superpower in that regard. And I hope that it would develop it, in a responsible way. But Africa, I mean, I suppose it's two things. It's what its own governments have done, or rather have not done, because there has been a spectacular lack of good governance in Africa. And we must hold the Africans responsible for that. There's no question. However, they are operating in a very, very difficult international environment where the international economic order is loaded against them. And also when your economies have been developed in the colonial era, so that, your roads just lead out to the port, it's an export to send to Europe. It doesn't connect bits of the hinterland, the community. So, the old thing about you can't fly from Ghana to Nigeria without having to go via London or something like that. It's true. It hasn't been set up, and Africa trades very little with itself compared to other parts of the world. So there's a lot for Africa to do. I would say that they've not been given a good hand economically by the international system, but also they have failed a great deal. If you look at illicit financial flows from Africa, or the money that leaves the continent because of corruption, it's about 100 billion. If you look at overseas development assistance to Africa, it's half of that. So, you can see that actually Africa is a net contributor. And when you look at the brain drain of medical personnel, for instance, it's as though Africa is growing doctors and nurses to just have them, go and work in the Gulf or in Europe or whatever. So when you look at it, these things have to be looked at. But it is interesting when you look at it that actually Africa gives, for every dollar it gets, it probably gives out 10. So I mean, I think, though, what I find heartening now about Africans today is, first of all, the young people. You have to put your faith in the young people. Most of the continent, the average age in Africa is 18, 19. In the United Kingdom, it's 40. In Japan, it's 44, whatever. It's a young continent, and young people have got zest and energy, and they want to, make a living for themselves. And some of them are very digitally savvy. So I have to put my faith in them. But what I think is interesting is probably after COVID, when Africans saw that when it came to the vaccine distribution, they were at the bottom of the pile. I think that made them really think, you know what, we're going to have to rely on ourselves. I think that self-reliance as the way forward is a message that has really come home to Africa now. And I do see that, domestic resource mobilization, mobilizing your domestic resources, having an industrialization plan, because Africa must industrialize. So I see green shoots of recovery. Give it 20 years. Bad now. We've seen the coups, in my beloved Sudan.
The big turmoil happening right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to, welcome everybody now again and open it up for our very, distinguished audiences. While I welcome all of my colleagues, professors, and my students as well, and all of our students at ASU and abroad, and our guests as well. And I see Dr. Afaf Bushra, our good friend, raising her hand. Afaf, could you please unmute yourself and go ahead? You're muted. Afaf. Until Afaf comes, if anybody else would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and unmute yourself and go ahead. There is a comment on the chat that I can read from Samia Suleiman and others as well. Samia, are you here? Would you like, because there are many messages, can you read your comment? She's speaking about Professor Ali Mizraoui as well.
Yeah, I see one question in the chat here about
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think I am unmute now. I have been unmuted. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Go ahead, Afaf.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to discuss this, and thank you very much, Dr. Zeinab Badawi, for this really excellent lecture. I have questions that may have roots in what you studied, which is you pointed out to the opportunities that we have, the youth, the training, the natural resources, etc., that would make would put Africa in a very good position to catch up with other continents, if I say, or our countries with other countries. But two challenges that have proven to stand on the way. One of them is ethnic strife and the issues with ethnicity and the extent of conflict. For the most part, it's ethnic conflict. And of course, it's become like kind of a proxy conflict to the other countries in the world, not unlike what was going on during the Cold War. This is one challenge that may have its roots in what you have discussed earlier in relation to the influence of the West in general. The second challenge is the issue of corruption. Very few African countries have managed to have good governance. And that, of course, is key for any progress. So to some extent, to what extent do you see this as a product of Western influence? And to what extent can we rely on our positive history to fight back and get rid of those two, I see, most important challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think ethnicity is a factor, of course. But if you take the worst manifestation of ethnic strife, Rwanda, with the genocide in 1994, all the Rwandans I've spoken to, and just looking at the history, there is no doubt that ethnic differences were really created by the Belgians, undoubtedly. And, the idea of your Hutu and your Tutsi and the animosity that developed between them was very much a product of Belgians' divide and rule. They've done that. The Europeans did that in so many. So I would say that is one thing. There are external factors like that, which created strife where it didn't exist. I think that political leaders will also exploit. I'm not saying people don't have different ethnic communities, but doesn't have to be, doesn't mean that you have to therefore be in conflict with somebody from a different ethnic community. But I think that politicians, some leaders do exploit these differences for their own ends. So I think that that is something that they must stop doing. And I think that we are moving in the right direction there. If you look at surveys like Afrobarometer's surveys of across the continent, asking people, do you obviously have an ethnic identity? Yes. Is your ethnic identity more important than your national identity? You find that that one is diminishing, whereas the national identity is becoming more important. So I think that's a very good trend. And I would say that that is a trend that you see on the continent. Last year, during the Kenyan elections, I was a member of the Commonwealth Observer Group for the elections, because, of course, we've seen strife in elections in Kenya in the past. And one thing we all concluded was that ethnicity was a diminishing factor in the Kenya elections. You saw people who, might have been Kikuyu voting for a non-Kikuyu, and it seemed to be that people were thinking more of, bread and butter issues, certainly. So it may be a case of, 2 steps forward, 1 back, 3 forward, 2 back, or whatever. But I think the trend is going in the right direction, that people are beginning to coalesce around a national identity. But I think that there are some leaders who don't do that, who will use it. It's really a fight about resources, money, control, power, whatever. And the ethnicity is used as a way of whipping that up. But corruption is a big problem, undoubtedly. And I think that citizens of Africa are becoming better versed in their civic rights. And again, surveys show that people want democracy. Even those people who welcomed the coups in Guinea-Conakry when Alpha Condé was removed, or Ali Bongo was removed in Gabon, just because they cheered the end of a dynasty that had been in power for, nearly 60 years, it doesn't mean that they don't want democracy down the line. It's not like Africans support military coups. And even Sudan, which is in such a dismal state at the moment, we mustn't forget that this was the 3rd time that the citizens of Sudan removed a military dictator from power. In the mid-60s, General Aboud, in the mid-80s, General Nimeri, and then 2019, Omar al-Bashir. Not in a violent way. Of course, some people died, and any death is always a tragedy. But, it was through civil disobedience, protests on the streets. I was in Sudan in April and August 2019. It was marvelous to see. It was like, so we mustn't lose sight of that. I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, President Zeinab. If anybody else would like to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and go ahead. There are some comments in the chat, but I don't see any questions.
I see a question here. A brilliant, I agree that our hope rests. This is Alia Jamal.
Alia Jamal, yes.
My question,
go ahead.
Is she there? Can she speak?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead. You can read it.
My question is on the point you made about how the historical context promotes empathy and thereafter justice. Could you elaborate how to go about justice? Sorry, my chair here is squeaking a little bit. I should have got a better chair. So I think that I'm talking about reparative justice here, because there is a call for reparations. And I think the most convincing case for reparations, in my opinion, has been made by the CARICOM countries, the Caribbean countries, it stands for, the Caribbean community, CARICOM. And they had 10 points that they came up with in 2016, 2017, I think it was, around that time. And, it's not this idea that everybody of African descent whose ancestors were enslaved, turns up with a bag of money on Monday morning, or whatever. I don't mean that, because there have been some people in America who've said everybody should get that bag of money, even Oprah Winfrey, even billionaires. But I think what CARICOM say is we should have reparative justice, reparations, and they come in the form of development aid, specifically for schools and health. And if you think about it, the Caribbean countries actually don't get any development aid from the United Kingdom, which was the colonizer, because they are, by and large, middle-income countries. But there are some very well-off people who drag up the average, and there's some very poor people in the Caribbean. So I think that's what I mean by a greater understanding, greater empathy, knowledge about what happened in the past empathy can lead to justice. We've already seen, as I said, King Charles being very empathetic in what he had to say to the Mau Mau, about the Mau Mau case.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, President Zeinab. Thank you for the question, Dr. Afaf and Alia Jamal. Anybody else who would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand or just unmute yourself and go ahead. Muhammad, Bashmahandis Muhammad Jad Kareem, go ahead, please. Nayan, can you unmute Professor Muhammad Jad Kareem, please?
Yes.
Just unmute everybody. Thank you. Bashmahandis Jad Kareem, can you unmute yourself? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. And thank you, Dr. Souad Ali, for organizing this. And thank you, the speaker, Dr. Zeinab al-Badawi, for this insightful lecture. Yeah, in my situation, I am an engineer. I actually studied mapping, and mapping, sometimes you follow the movement of people across time and space. However, I also got interested in history around 2010, 2011 up to 2013. I was part of a learning community that we studied the history, part of the Community Extension Center at the Ohio State University. So we went like maybe more than 3 semesters on studying the history of Africa. So part of the study of history and culture is actually because you are studying change, and change. Yeah, you also follow the people and the space and their culture. So my question to you: what tools actually you recommend? Because if we want to, after understanding history, and if we want to change the status quo or the relationship, okay, then you have to act in a certain recommended way. So, in your opinion, what tools of analysis that we should follow, and what recommendation? Say now we are in 2023, and the situation in Sudan is completely not only disturbing, but it's also very saddening for us. So I hope you give me an idea about how we could influence change after we understand, or we understood your framework of studying history. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I would say self-reliance has to be the way for Africa to develop. You can't rely on outsiders to do it, because they've had a detrimental impact on the continent on the whole. And even, if you rely, just as the revolution in Sudan, in a sense, was a failure of international diplomacy because there wasn't enough support given to the transitional government, that, you know, people didn't reap the economic dividends of, you know, seeing the end of Umar al-Bashir, you know, issues of debt. There wasn't enough money coming in, which made it very difficult. And I suppose COVID came along. I'm being generous here, so people kept their eye off the ball. But I suppose the one lesson would be that you can't rely on the outside world. You know, no country in history really has been developed by outsiders. And I don't see why Africans should think anything else other than that. So I would say, you know, I've encouraging things like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to encourage greater trade in between countries. You know, they have to get their act together, bring down the barriers, have, you know, strong regulatory frameworks, so that, because the cost of capital, you know, the private sector won't go into Africa because the cost of capital is so high. And it's so high because capital is a coward and it doesn't want to go to somewhere which is not safe or secure. So there is a lot that I think, I mean, African leaders, I think, have let the continent down.
Yeah.
But so I would say the one lesson, yes, is the lesson from history is look to yourself.
Yes, Zainab, look to yourself, but if the outside world would leave you looking into yourself, leave you alone, because if you look at history, I mean, in Burkina Faso, I can't remember the name of the president at the time, but he was all for self-reliance and people depending on themselves, building their own railways and stuff. And then at the end of the day, the CIA killed him. So, yeah, you know, yes, self-reliance, but, you know, the outside world has also to take responsibility to leave Africa develop on its own. And that's sometimes it's a no-go because there's too much interest in Africa's natural resources. And they always manage to choose to single out the right people for governance. If you have someone like Lumumba, no, that doesn't go. So there is the geopolitical aspect of it that, and then at Hamdok's transitional period, it wasn't only that the international community didn't support him. Hamdok himself made many achievements, but he did not listen to the resistance committees enough. They were marginalized at the expense of political parties. And they are the ones who made the sacrifices and brought down one of the most vicious regimes in the history of Sudan. So what I wanted to say is that this study that you have made is so timely, because the other day I was listening to another talk and about, you know, the resistance committee, Lijan al-Muqawama, and their developments and all of that. And the speaker was talking about, you know, the historical evolution. And the participants were telling him, you know, don't bother us with history. But history is important for the confidence of those people. If the people know that those young, what we call them, kandakat and shafatat, if they know their history, they are inspired to do more. There is one scene in this revolution that I can never forget. There was a young lady who was asked, why are you in the streets? And she said, because I want to see the Sudan that my fathers are telling me about.
Yeah.
And that's important. And we are a fortunate generation because we saw that good time. Yeah. Our children haven't seen that and they question it. So thank you for, you know, bringing this important historical perspective to the forefront. And I'm wondering if your book also addresses, you know, the kandakats of the Kush, because we have about, from what I hear, there are about 250 kandakats. And I hope your book addresses that.
Yeah.
And also the CARICOM.
Yeah, I do look at some of the kandakas, yeah, a couple. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, history, if you're told it's not relevant to Sudan because Sudan wasn't part of the transatlantic slave trade, in terms of the northern Sudanese you're talking about. But if people think their history only started with oppression and slavery, it's a history that depicts them only as victims, whereas actually they have a great history before that.
Exactly.
Becomes part of self-confidence and so on. And I think it's particularly relevant to countries like the United States, where you are, Dr. Souad, because African Americans often start their history with slavery. And slavery accorded Black Africans inferior status, and you cannot dismantle that racism until you dismantle the ideology on which it was based, which is you are inferior, you are the descendant of a slave. If you say, well, actually, I had this, I had that before, you can hold your head up higher.
Thank you very much indeed. Just to go back to what Ali and Jamal just mentioned, as far as our fathers and what they witnessed, and if we look in Sudan modern history, at least some of what we have witnessed, for me it's the October Revolution. But if we see since independence, according to history and what history books tell us, that a military coup took place immediately after, a couple of years after independence, in 1958. The Sudan got its independence 56. And General Aboud staged a coup, and that lasted for 6 years. Then we have the Great October Revolution that we do remember, but the one that I participated in was 1985, when I was a student at the University of Khartoum, after Nimeri. And so Nimeri came after the October Revolution, lasted only for a few years, and Nimeri came in 1965, in 1950, the October Revolution was 1964, and he came in
69.
yes, 15, and he stayed until in 85. Yes, 85. Yeah, he came in May 25th, right? And stayed for 16 years until 1985, when we had the popular uprising in 1985 that we contributed to. And usually it's the university students who take to the streets, and and then it was a very successful revolution of April 6th of 1985. And 1 year we had elections, and 1986 there was a democratic government, freely elected. But it lasted only for 3 years. Then General Bashir came. He was not a general at that time, in 1989, and that was the military coup that stayed for 30 years until the popular, revolution in 2018. So for the most part of independence, the Sudan was ruled by military dictatorships, and this was the main problem in the country. But the argument is that, why did we have these military coups, whether in Sudan, in other countries? I mean, even if we go back to Chenwa Achibi, and things fall apart. And the argument is that for internal as well as external reasons. It wasn't only external, but internal as well. So it's a big, huge, complicated issue that we don't know what's happening now as far as Sudan and these negotiating with the dictators, the two dictators, the two criminals, and sidelining the civilians. It's a huge, it's not the issue of this lecture, but as President Zeinab said, she has an epilogue in her book about what is happening now in Africa, the whole country.
But
you must go to my aunt Balqis Badri. I see her hand is up.
Professor Balqis Badri, thank you very much for joining us, and let's go and please unmute yourself and go ahead. Nayan, please unmute everybody if they can't mute themselves. Thank you. Talking to my graduate assistant. She cannot unmute herself. The Nayan, please unmute everybody.
Professor, I have asked everyone to unmute, so it's upon them to unmute themselves.
Okay. Professor
Okay,
Balkis,
yes,
please.
now,
finish.
now,
Yeah,
yes. Um,
we can hear you.
hello, everybody. Hello, Zainab. كيفك?
جاي كويس شكرا. Very good.
Okay, and I have got a question related to this issue of ethnicity, because now we are trying to do a kind of a research on the impact of ethnicity or ethnic diversity, democracy, peace, which comes first. So my question is, which comes first? Is it that the priority should be given to democracy so as to end this ethnic affiliation pride, or is it that economic development should be the priority that will end it? And there is also a link between economic development as democracy so as to have transparency and good governance principles. So there are these kind of interlink. That is why I think we shouldn't say that Africa should only depend on itself, but we are hoping on in Sudan, for example, Sudanese in the diaspora should help with training, with the development of project, so as to help the small entrepreneurs, the big business people, to establish companies there in the countries of diaspora and link with our own countries. I think there should be some kind of a role for Sudanese in the diaspora to help us with economic development as well as with models for a democratic state and the type of state and things like that. So we really need and expect quite a lot from you. Thank you.
Shukran, ya Bilhis. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I didn't mean, no person is an island, but I just think when I said self-reliance, I don't mean just Africa closes itself and only looks inwards, but it has to be the main agent of its own destiny. But yes, you're right, the diaspora can help. And there are ways that some countries are doing that. Remittances are very important, of course, and some people are setting up, like in, I think it's Somalia, remittances for like remittance bonds for development and so on. So I think there are lots of interesting financial instruments, and I know the African Development Bank is looking at those. And you're right, Bilhis, that there's a big debate about democracy versus development. We saw in the 90s, Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, very much emphasizing that development aspect. And, the democracy comes later. But I would say it's not an either or, really. I think you can pursue both in tandem.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. As we're running out of time, Hadil, you wanted to have a comment or a question? Go ahead.
I have a comment. Hello.
Go ahead.
Hear me, everyone?
Hello.
Hello.
Hadil Akash. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Dr. Souad. I really appreciate your invitation. And I'm very honored to be a part of the meeting. I actually watched Dr. Zeinab's Al-Badawi's documentary a few years ago. And I was so happy. I remember I was like, finally, we have somebody that actually, you know what I mean, spoke to the outside world about our country, because we're always...
You mean?
Huh?
Continent.
Yes, about our continent and, the continent history and everything. So I remember I was very excited. I was like, I wish there's more people like you, because I feel like the world I don't want to say diminishes or like they don't know too much about the African history, and I felt that was really good to have. You know, it's really good to have someone like you who can actually speak to the Western world about this. I have a comment. I just feel like as a Sudanese American, I grew up in America since I was 11 years old, and you know, because you live in a dual cultures and you see all kind of stuff. So suddenly we just, you know, we've seen like lots of country corruptions and stuff. So I just feel like as a historian, you should really like focus on, I know politics is a very dangerous topic, but you should really kind of include that maybe in your next book, speaking about the political and how, you know, maybe about the previous governments, how they, you know, because that's history too. History is not always the good picture. There is good and bad in every history. So I just feel like you should speak more about that, so people so everyone should be aware that we've been oppressed for a very long time, and it's really important to speak about that, because what we see now, I see a lot of even Sudanese, even our own people that are pro al-Bashir, or they're pro like military, whatever. I don't know what's your like political view about this you know, recent corruption, but I just feel like the more you talk about that, because I just feel like Sudanese people have been programmed to think a certain way, to their, you know what I mean? If you're say you're anti-government, it means you're bad, or, you know, you're not going to enter the country, or, you know, like, I just feel like everyone is scared to you know, say their honest opinion of what of the, you know, the whole corruption.
Thank you, Hadi, very much indeed. The message you know, went through. I'm gonna give President Zainab to make, you know, to can address Hadi's point and make her final remarks as we run out of time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure being with all of you, and also this interaction has been very enjoyable. Yes, no, I take your point, but I suppose I embarked on the history. Having just finished this book, I'm not sure I can think of another one to do, but maybe I will try and engage on Sudan in a different way, because now that I've been so consumed with this book that I have kept my eye off the ball on Sudan. So certainly I will turn my attention to not necessarily writing a book, but trying to see what can be done in the humanitarian, political, civil society space in Sudan.
Thank you very much indeed. Maha, I'll just give you a very short time, please, in 1 minute or so, to say your comment or question. Maha, go ahead. Unmute yourself. She has her hand up.
Okay, if the time is running out, my question I put it in the chat. Or
you've written
there
it,
is
or
time I can.
You can just go
yeah,
ahead and see it in a very short, you know, just a 1 minute, please.
Okay. My question is that first, let me thank you for the very interesting lecture, and to be with you. It's honored to be with you, Dr. Souad and Dr. Zeinab Badawi. But I was wondering, Dr. Zeinab, to what extent do our scholars, historian, and academia contributed in our ignorance and ignorance and this darkness we live with regard to our history, pro-colonial. Even after independence, after all these politicians, although I think they were very much fascinated by the European or the Western cultures, and they walk on the same steps of these Western cultures, we have not looked back at our history at all. We were even in schools, we were taught the Middle East, we were taught the European history, the two Americans. We were never taught about, maybe about Sudan, very little, pro-colonial, very, very little. But our education system has not looked at Africa history. So it is due to this fascination by the Western cultures and Western education.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Sorry?
Maha. Thank you very much indeed. We'll give
I think
President
you have a
Zeinab
very
chance.
valid point. I think you have a very valid point that, you know, the legacy of colonialism means that modernity has been defined as what goes on in the West, and, you know, being aware of Roman history, Greek, Western history, European, you know, and so on and so forth has been the definition of what an educated person should be, classical music and so on. So I agree with you. I think that those elites who were educated in the in the Western education system may have that kind of view. But I have to say that all the academics I saw went on my journeys across Africa, they all had PhDs from, you know, leading Western institutions, but they were all actually, their views were, you know, were not tainted by that. I think I would say that none of them really had a good word to say about colonialism, for instance. So it could be that that's changed, but I think that what you say is true to some extent, but I now see that it's changed. I think the world, you know, culture has become more global, and I don't think they necessarily perpetuate that legacy of colonialism.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, President Zeinab, and thank you very much indeed, all of our colleagues and students and guests, and we hope that we continue at the council to promote multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion, interfaith dialogue, cross-cultural understanding, and the expansion of human civilization and cultures. You know, as we promote these lecture series and our other events, we invite you to please visit our website for upcoming events. This is, you know, a closure of the semester towards the end of the fall semester. We resume in the spring semester as well. So at this point, thank you very much indeed, everybody, and we hope to see you all again. And if President Zeinab has, you know, final thoughts, please go ahead and.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Dr. Souad, for inviting me. It was a great honor and privilege to be with all of you. I hope that, you know, we will have more opportunity to discuss these issues. Thank you.
And we hope to see you sometimes in person, coming to ASU at Arizona State University. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. We really appreciate that we have a very good audience, and, you know, and almost 60 people were here initially. Still, we have 36 at the end of the session. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a good day.